Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. This is the Science, Facts, and Fallacies podcast, episode 278. We're getting up there. Lots of episodes under our belts. It's very, very exciting. My name is Cameron English. That's Dr. Liza Dunn. How are you, Liza?
Hi. Fine. How are you?
I am terrific. It's been a great day so far. We just wrapped up our most recent space. We talked about chemophobia, and in particular how you have major news outlets and activist groups, even some scientists in some cases, who are putting out all this alarming information about the dangers of chemicals. And they're doing so in a way that is dishonest in some cases. When you're talking about veteran reporters or people with academic backgrounds,
People who should know better.
They do know better. You know, well, Eliza's going to give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm just going to say that they're hucksters. And there are other adjectives that you could describe what they do. Anyways, but there's a lot of nonsense out there, and so we just went through some of the key issues that have been in the headlines, plastics and PFAS and pesticides, and talked about some of the hallmarks of an incorrect news story, let's say.
Yes, yes.
Because they all have, there's a reoccurring theme, there's there's like guideposts, right? When someone's lying to you, you learn to pick up on the things that they tend to say. Anyways, we'd love to have you at our spaces. They're very informative. There's lots of experts. Liza is our chief, science in chief, if you want to call it. I don't know. But there's multiple toxicologists and chemists who show up regularly. We've got farmers. We've got an all-star lineup of people.
We do, and they're really good spaces. A lot of spaces can be kind of wild and people having big, huge arguments and Jerry Springer-like. But these spaces tend to be very civilized. So you can come and disagree with us, and we won't get mad at you, but we may disagree.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. We actually got to debunk a silly story in real time.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Which was super cool. Someone posted it in the chat, and we said, "Hey, funny story. Let's take a look at this." Right. So it's very helpful to be a part of that. So come check it out. They are every Friday at 11 a.m. Central Time, and they're usually an hour to an hour and a half, and they're a great time, and you'll learn some stuff. Okay, let's get into our stories. We've got 3 as always. So first up,
and they're great this week.
Yes. These are, well, I'm just going to read the headlines, and I'm going to let you guys in on the secret. So, California mulls legalization of psilocybin, MDMA, and other psychedelic drugs to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. Next up, throw away your lead-soaked tampons. Clickbait headlines exaggerate misrepresented study. And finally, rising drug prices and shortages now fueled in part by the very reform mechanism promised to curtail them. Really good stuff, especially this last one, Liza. Going to be an important topic to discuss. First up, though, and this is a reoccurring theme. I told Liza offline the other day that drugs are my new favorite hobby. Reading about and writing about. It's such a fascinating topic. There's so many different edges to this discussion, and I love it. So here we're talking about my stomping grounds, my home, which is horribly mismanaged California. This is a story originally by Bernard Wolfson, and he's talking about a bill in California initially that was put forward to legalize the use of psychedelic drugs in California. There's unsurprisingly, being California, the left coast, there is a huge movement pushing for drug legalization more generally, but then for psychedelics, there is a pretty big lobby to get this over the finish line. There are legislators in the state assembly and the state senate who are behind this idea, and they got it all the way to the governor's desk, I want to say.
Yes.
And then he said no.
Which is so surprising.
Yeah.
Surprising.
Yeah, our governor, Gavin Newsom, is an odd duck. His interest in science is fair weather, to put it politely. Mm-hmm. But in any case, the legalization push failed. And then there's another bill it's still going through the legislative process, I believe, at the time of us recording this, that would approve the use of psychedelics for medicinal purposes, in particular for post-traumatic stress disorder. Mm-hmm. And Liza, you can talk more about that. I think you've actually treated people with that, if I'm not mistaken.
I haven't. I haven't treated them with psychedelics. Well, except ketamine. But anyway, not for depression. But I've used ketamine on patients before.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. So the ER physician will have some insight here,
Yeah.
but it's a fascinating story. The way this is developing, there are scientific aspects to this, but of course it's political because you're talking about getting a bill passed. So there's lots of different incentives. But the interesting thing to me, before I turn this over to you, is this opening anecdote that the story starts with. It's about a gentleman named Wade Trammell, who's a firefighter, and he responded to a highway crash, and what he saw at the crash scene really messed with his head, and he developed post-traumatic stress. So for years after this, he was reliving it, and it's pretty terrifying when you understand how that condition works. But he took psilocybin, and I think he only took it once, and that alleviated or greatly alleviated the trauma that he was re-experiencing. And then this leads into a conversation about how although it's not right for everyone and there are some risks involved, like we talked about last week, there are a lot of benefits here, and it would probably behoove us to consider them, at least in a medical context. So what do you think, Liza? Fill in the gaps.
Yeah, so I'm thinking, well, it mechanistically, it makes sense for drugs in this class, or chemicals in this class, tryptamine class, to uh, alleviate mood problems and anxiety problems and things like that. We use right now clinically SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, most often to alleviate mood, but psilocybin and other things like that, like LSD, are in the same class of chemicals as serotonin. So serotonin is your happy neurotransmitter, and the thought is that people who have some kind of, I'm just going to say, imbalance in their brains, don't have enough serotonin floating around to keep their mood up or their anxiety levels a little bit lower. And so serotonin reuptake inhibitors, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, alleviate that a little bit and improve mood. Now, what's really interesting is that there are case reports in several case series. I'll get into why it's very hard to do a randomized double-blind controlled trial with these things, that serotonin-like substances, so tryptamines like LSD and psilocybin, may be beneficial in refractory depression. And there have been several studies that have demonstrated this. So the sort of groundbreaking one was several years ago. I'm going to say maybe back even in 2010 or 12, looking at people with terminal cancer and very, very anxious about the diagnosis, very, very concerned about and depressed about the diagnosis. And so they did a trial with them, and it really improved their mood. Now, the question is, you're not going to be able to do a double blind randomized controlled trial because you're going to know who's tripping, and the patients are going to know who's tripping. So you're not going to be able to do a placebo controlled trial with this. So so blinding is going to be an issue all the time with this kind of thing. But it's also interesting because some patients will present and sort of be interested in this as a possibility anyway. So is there kind of a placebo effect, right? We don't know. But is there kind of a placebo effect because they're expecting it to work for their depression? So that's another question that you can't really tell because you can't have a placebo arm with this. But it's very, very interesting that there are a whole set of different kinds of drugs that people are looking at that are thought to maybe help with mood. And these drugs are called entheogens, finding the God from within. And many of them started out as being used in shamanistic rituals. And we talked about J. Gordon Wasson, who was a VP at JP Morgan, going down to southern Mexico to try magic mushrooms with the indigenous population there, and then writing a whole big, huge spread on it in Life magazine in, I want to say, 1957. And so that really sort of popularized this new this new drug that people got very, very interested in. But so SSRIs help concentrate serotonin in the brain, as do LSD and psilocybin. SSRIs do it without hallucinations. People may benefit if we could figure out how to maybe turn down the hallucinations for these drugs. So
fascinating stuff. I'm just looking at a picture in this article, which is so funny. There's a minister or a priest
yes.
of some sort from a church in San Francisco and Oakland, California. That's the Bay Area. It's right on the West Coast there for people that aren't familiar. His name is Dave Hodges, founder and pastor of the Church of Ambrosia, and this guy looks exactly how you expect him to look.
Would imagine.
He's got like green flowing robe with a white vest of some sort with rainbow colors on it, and then he's got a hat on that has marijuana leaves on it. And his hands are held out like this in a very ritualistic.
That's exactly right.
Holy sort of a way.
That's exactly right. Now, there are other drugs that people are talking about as being beneficial in refractory depression as well. And so the other two things that they've talked about are ecstasy and ketamine. So ketamine is actually PCP light. So I don't know if you've ever heard about every Halloween there's rumors that go around that if kids are going to get angel dust in their candy. I don't know if that was a, sort of folklore when we were trick-or-treating and how bad angel dust is. And so that's phencyclidine or PCP. PCP was developed and used in the 50s as a general anesthetic for people. And it's great because it doesn't cause respiratory depression. But it does have this emergence phenomenon where people go absolutely wild as they're waking up from and recovering from their operations. So PCP went very quickly by the wayside when people would get wild on the operating table and, spill their guts on the floor and have to start all over. So it got removed from the market and then was made a Schedule I drug that is abused. But ketamine is like PCP light. So it is used routinely in the ER to sedate people for painful procedures. The reason why people think that PCP gives patients real incredible strength is because they don't feel pain. And so they overdo what should be limiting for them, right? So they don't really have superhuman strength. They just don't have that pain reflex to stop them from doing something like moving furniture or whatever. My favorite PCP patient came into the ER after crashing into a wrought iron fence in front of a police officer. Got out of his car completely naked and started having intimate relations with his gas tank. And so, yes, the police officer brought him to the hospital, and yes, he was, having wild hallucinations and things like that. So you obviously don't want your patients to be doing that when you're, they're recovering from some surgical procedure. Anyway, so ketamine it came on the market. Ketamine is widely used as for anesthesia. And you will notice, I don't know if you've ever seen the viral video of David After Dentist. So David After Dentist, go watch it because that will show you what patients on ketamine are like. They're a little bit more quiet, but they're having these wild hallucinations and sometimes say very, very funny things. And it's entertaining. But ketamine, one of the patients that I was kind of astounded by, ketamine is thought to possibly have antidepressant effects as well. And I noticed this in a patient who was having a miscarriage. And she was at her sister's wedding when it started. She was very traumatized by the whole thing, presented just weeping, profoundly depressed. They'd been trying very hard to have a baby, and she was just beside herself. So we sedated her with ketamine in order to be able to do the D&C because the baby was not viable. And after the procedure, her mood was completely changed. And I was stunned at the change. And I think people who have seen this kind of thing over and over with this particular drug thought, maybe there's something really that has a antidepressant effect in it. And it makes sense because ketamine works on the NMDA receptor in the brain. And the NMDA receptor, when it's blocked, and PCP does this too, when it's blocked, you wind up with hallucinations. And so the NMDA receptor is a glutamate is the neurotransmitter that usually works on it, and it's an excitatory neurotransmitter. So it opens up the channel, and you get calcium and sodium in the cells of the brain, and those are positively charged, so that makes your brain a little bit more excited. When you block that, you can have florid hallucinations. And there's actually a disease called NMDA receptor encephalitis that young women get when they have a kind of tumor called a teratoma. And it can be misdiagnosed as florid psychosis. So people, they can be diagnosed with schizophrenia when they actually have a tumor that's making them have an antibody reaction to these receptors in their brain. So it's associated with hallucination. And so blocking it makes you have hallucinations. And that's where ketamine does that. Now it's thought that possibly the modulation of the receptor in the brain may also have a persistent antidepressant effect. And so nobody's really quite sure why, but it's pretty impressive to see this. And I was very struck by this patient. The other thing that people have been using as an antidepressant is ecstasy, MDMA. And ecstasy really acts on serotonergic nerves and helps release more serotonin as well. And it was used in psychiatry for a very long time until it started getting diverted to the club scene. And it's got a very interesting story because these raves, it tended to be, in college students going to this. Lots of professionals would go to raves and things like that. But there was a big scare when Science published an article that said that they had given monkeys 8 tablets of ecstasy over 4 days, I think it was. I can't remember all the details of it. But long and short was the monkeys then got massive degeneration of their serotonergic nerves in their brains. It literally ate holes in their brains. So people were very frightened. And then they went and studied the monkeys 7 years later. The one they culled half and then did 7 years later the other ones. And there was still profound neurologic damage. So there was a huge fear that ecstasy was going to be causing florid brain damage in people. And the psychiatrists that had used it in talk therapy before were like, no, this is ridiculous. If you have holes in your brain, you should really have signs of that somehow phenotypically. So you should see some muscle wasting or something like that. And they couldn't replicate the study. And so the study eventually had to get retracted because when the authors went back and actually looked at it, they found that they had used methamphetamine rather than ecstasy. And that's kind of interesting because if you look at, there's something called a poster called the Faces of Meth. And there is a kind of phenotype that you get with methamphetamine abuse, with muscle wasting, grinding of the teeth, dental decay, and then tweaking is the term that people use for just very wild psychomotor behavior and agitated behavior. And methamphetamine crosses the blood-brain barrier much better than amphetamine does, and it looks like it does probably cause some neurologic damage. So it's a very interesting study. And so ecstasy is now back sort of being looked at as a possible modulator of serotonin again and improved mood.
So the moral of the story is don't give monkeys methamphetamine. They're going to have a bad day. Sounds like they're going to have a bad 7 years because you're going to kill half of them and the other ones get giant holes in their brains. They get meth mouth apparently.
Yeah.
Yeah, but in all seriousness, it's fascinating. It sounds like there is some medicinal use possibilities here. There's also some risks. Read the article to get more about those. I don't want to spend too much time. Um, but it's like anything else, right? There's a risk and there's a benefit, and we need to consider both before making a decision. So thank you for that breakdown. This is why you listen to this podcast, because we have a toxicologist and a doctor that just goes on 15-minute soliloquies about how drugs affect you. There you go. You're all a little bit smarter. Okay. Story number 2, Liza. This is again by our good friend, Dr. Andrea Love, who is an immunologist, just an all-around sharp lady with lots of insight to share. This time she's talking about a recent study. For some reason, I don't know why anyone would look at this and get grant money to do this, but they looked at the lead contamination in tampons. So the story is called "Throw Away Your Lead-Soaked Tampons?" ? Clickbait headlines exaggerate misrepresented study. And again, this is well-worn territory for us. Liza, again, you can explain the science much better, but in essence, you had a study that came out that is potentially interesting if it's properly qualified, as few of them are these days, and the media ran with it, right? It's half the population roughly uses tampons, so it's a big story. Everyone blew it up. There's lead in your tampons, and you should be scared. And you know, none of the nuance of the study came through. None of the qualifications. It was all just be scared, be scared, be scared. Yeah, extremely frustrating. I'm already getting upset. I want you to, if you can, walk us through what the study did. But the one thing that's most important, I think, is Andrea talks about how the process they used to extract the lead from the tampons or whatever was wildly unlike the environment where tampons are actually used. Use your imaginations, everybody. And for that reason, it's all but useless in terms of explaining the risk to women from using a product like this. So take it away with that.
Yeah, so I think the way they extracted it was by using nitric acid and then a temperature that was, 140? I mean, just none of this is like physiologic, right? And they managed to get a little bit of lead out of a piece of cotton, which is not in the least bit surprising, considering that cotton grows in the ground and there is a little bit of lead in the ground, and it's just the way life is. And I think we talked about something similar to this a week or two ago. But it really is fear mongering, and it's funny because the amount of lead in there is not going to bother you at all. It's not going to be at any kind of physiologic concentration. The vaginal mucosa really does not absorb a lot of stuff because it's like skin, and skin is there to protect you from environmental toxins, I guess, if you want to put it that way. So you're not going to get hurt by touching lead, right? You'll get hurt if you eat lead, but you won't get hurt if you touch lead. And if you come across trace amounts, it's not going to bother you. The fact is, just like you can't get rid of every source of lead that's out there environmentally. And so I think it's a little bit silly to scare people with it. Now, it's interesting because a lot of money is made off of this. So there is somebody that I've been talking to on Twitter who has just said that, she discovered, because she found a wonderful doctor who got to the root of all of her problems, and she discovered that she's got lead poisoning. And because she's got lead poisoning, she's now getting chelation from said doctor. And she also said that she had thallium poisoning. And I said, if you had thallium poisoning, you'd be bald and you wouldn't be walking. And so lots of people are out there to make money off of this kind of fear. So there are laboratories that do testing that always, quote unquote, find high levels. They make lots of money from people who are afraid. And then there are doctors, unscrupulous physicians, that will chelate you for these kinds of issues. And so it benefits these people, these people who act unethically, to have stories like this coming out and having people perpetually feeling like they are being poisoned by some kind of toxin in some capacity. She's talking about being chelated, and she's talking about how much better she feels. And I think that that's really, really unfortunate.
Yes, indeed. I expressed similar frustration. I think it was last week. The stuff all runs together because we have to talk about it ad nauseum.
I know,
But
right?
as a consumer, as a parent who you're shopping for your kids now, clothes and food and bath soap and all this stuff, you have to think twice now if you don't have any background in this, and it can be scary, and that's just so unnerving. It's so irritating to me. Parents are trying to look out for their kids, and you are polluting their decision-making process with this complete and utter fertilizer.
That's right.
Use that word instead of the word I want to use. It's just wrong. It's cruel. Like, people are rightly scared for their children. The world can be very dangerous. And instead of allowing them to focus on what they need to, or in this case, just for women, right? You're trying to use a product that you have to use.
Yes, that's exactly right.
And now you have to deal with CNN and all these other idiotic news outlets bombarding you. And of course, they all show up on your Twitter feed and your TikTok feed. And then there's, Dr. Rando with no actual credentials who's telling you, oh, I've got lead-free tampons are only, $20 a pop or what. It's just...
That's right.
It's just infuriating. Okay, before we move on, let's try to get into some numbers without inundating people. So Andrea talks about the fact that, if you detect a chemical, and you just said this too, if you detect a chemical in a very low dose in a product, that doesn't mean it's harmful. It just means it's there. Mm-hmm. As you said, it grows in the ground. There's lead in the ground. It's not that complicated. But she points out it's the equivalent of 120 parts per billion. And she actually did a little experiment. She went and weighed a tampon at home. It weighs 2 grams. And so she said, based on the calculation for the amount of lead in there, it amounts to 0.00000024 grams. Right? So in terms of volume...
Essentially
of tampon,
zero.
Right. That's a number, but it is zero. For all intents and purposes, it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? Like, that's how little...
That's
the
right.
chemical is in here. And the one other comparison she makes is part per billion. And we've said this before, too. It's the equivalent of 1 second in 31 and a half years.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So, like the news could have led with this. According to an actual scientist we spoke to, this study means nothing and it's useless to you.
That's right? Exactly right. It could have been, don't worry about. This is wonderful. This is wonderful news. Look how safe these products are. Yeah. That's what it's just unfortunately lots of people are making money from it. I don't understand how people can stand to spend their whole lives so frightened, right? I mean, from COVID to everything, it just seems to me that people are just always on high alert, and maybe that's why people. Somebody on their space said, there's people are dying younger. Well, I think that's partially because of the opioid crisis and COVID. But I also think that people are way more stressed about things they don't need to be stressed about. So
people definitely develop a habit. The word addiction is overused, but I was listening to a conversation about foreign policy, and both of the commentators were pointing out that a lot of people's perceptions about what's going on in the world outside of their immediate circumstances comes from social media, right? So you see videos of kids bleeding to death, which is horrifying and tragic. I don't mean to minimize that. You see videos of bombs going off and people screaming in foreign languages, and it's alarming. But the point they were making is that, you get sort of an adrenaline rush from that. And so it's not strictly speaking that people like to be fearful, but they do like watching horror movies, right? There's a shock factor and a scare factor, and you get kind of a thrill. For some reason, I don't count myself among this, but watching
I hate horror movies.
Someone getting stabbed in the face with a knife over, like that's thrilling to some people. I don't get it, but that's real. That could be one of the reasons that people keep coming back to that. Incidentally, before we move on, you could put a grabby headline on this. You could say something like, study investigates lead in tampons. Do you have to be worried, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's a bit of a leading, loaded question, but then people click on the article, and the first
click
sentence
on the article,
is,
and you're
not really.
Yes, you're telling the truth. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So you could frame this as an interesting story, because that's one thing that came up on our space too, is that, well, the media has to attract eyeballs, and so they exaggerate. And as a journalist, I say, go jump off a bridge. That's not acceptable. Your job is to educate
Tell the
people
truth.
Who are busy, right?
Yep.
Your job is to tell them what they need to know. Don't scare them. You can make it entertaining and engaging, That's your job.
That's right. That's
right?
exactly
That's
right.
your job. Okay, we're done. Deep breaths, Cameron. I'm okay. We're going to get through this. Okay.
Oh, I'll tell you, wait, really
Yeah.
quick.
Yes,
The
of course.
previous one, the paramedic who saw that terrible accident and was having PTSD, one of the things that he took some toad venom too. Don't do that, right? You can have a cardiac arrest. They make cardiac glycosides, and that can make your heart stop. So I would not recommend that. So if you go read the article, don't lick toads. Thanks.
The more you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Just as a rule, don't take a drug that you don't know what it is
That's right.
or what's in it or what it does. Talk
That's
to
right.
your doctor, or at least go on social media and talk to Liza or someone, or
Yeah, you can
like,
ask me.
Dr. Liza, should I lick a toad? No, you
No.
should not. There you go. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Moving on. Final story of the day. Rising drug prices and shortages now fueled in part by the very reform mechanism promised to curtail them. Fascinating story, Liza. This is, this is a clash between public health and science and economics, which are all of my favorite nerd topics. And there's some really important details in the story. This is by my colleague, Dr. Henry Miller at the American Council on Science and Health. He was a former FDA official and was involved in approving the first genetically engineered insulin product, which was called Humulin. And we've talked about it before. That's a whole fascinating story. But the essence here is that Henry's very smart, and he knows what the drug regulation process is like in the United States. And here, again, I'm going to turn this over to Liza. This is so great doing a podcast with a doctor, because you can just go, hey, explain this. Henry's talking here about the fact that pharmaceutical drugs are exorbitantly expensive, and we actually have shortages of some drugs that are, all drugs that are on the market serve a purpose, but some important drugs. Ironically, I interviewed Henry a little while ago, and he was telling me that there's actually, or there was for a time, a shortage of pharmaceutical grade fentanyl, which in hospitals is used as a pain reliever for
Yes.
during surgeries and anesthetics and so forth. It's a very important drug. Of course, you can go anywhere in any major city and get very dangerous fentanyl that will kill you in one shot. So don't
Exactly
do that.
right.
Don't lick
Nope.
toads, and don't do fentanyl on the street.
That's exactly right. That's
But
exactly
just illustrate the irony of it, right? Our healthcare system is so bogged down with regulation and perverse incentives, which are what we're going to talk about today, that there are shortages of drugs that people need. Meanwhile, there's this black market that does not deal with the FDA, right? The drug dealer doesn't care what the FDA thinks
That's
of its
exactly
fentanyl
right.
supply. So, but the key thing here, and Liza knows much more about this, is this role that plays an important part in our healthcare system called pharmacy benefit management. And this is something like a middleman between pharmaceutical companies and consumers, or you, right? When you take a medicine, and their job, I think, is to negotiate with the pharma company to get the most reasonable price for the best drug for the patient. And because of some shenanigans that have gone on in the regulatory sector over the last several decades, you basically have insurance companies gobbling up these benefit managers. And so their incentive is to bilk the pharma company for as much money as they can, so the pharma company gets a good placement of its drug in the formulary, and Liza can explain what that is. But basically, the pharma companies get blackmailed, right? Pay us this fee,
Yep.
and then we will make sure your drug gets to patients. And of course, the pharma company needs patients to use their drugs, or there's no money. So in essence, this inflates the prices of medications tremendously. And people who need medicine suffer because sometimes they can't get it, or sometimes they have to pay a ton more money for it. And it's just truly shameful. So Liza, I know there's much more to say, so please enlighten us.
Yeah, this is developed over several years, or several decades now. And it is part of the reason why the bureaucracy of healthcare has gotten, and the administrative burden of healthcare has gotten to be so crazy. And it is complex to understand, and I have tried to understand it for a long time. And if it's hard for me to kind of put all the pieces together without falling asleep, it's hard for other people to do that as well. So there are arrangements that hospitals and insurance companies and pharmacies and in pharmaceutical manufacturers have in order to facilitate the administration of drugs to patients. So pharma companies make drugs, and then the hospitals need to get the drugs to give to the patients. And the insurance company has a pharmacy benefit with it. And the other group that needs that's on the other side of this are pharmacists as well. So the insurance company will pay the pharmacist to administer the drugs to the patient, or not administer, but fill the prescription, and will also, I believe, and this is not mentioned in this article, but I believe that they're also involved. The PBMs are, well, you've got to get drugs on formulary for a hospital. So you've got the insurance company has a formulary that they will pay for. This is a list of drugs that's their preferred drugs to pay for. And then hospitals have formularies that they will, of drugs that they're first line drugs that they will use, their preferred drugs. Pharmaceutical companies need to have their drugs put on a formulary, and depending on which tier they are in on that formulary, they will get more of their pharmaceuticals sold. There's a middleman, the PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers. There's the GPOs too, and they also deal with hospitals. But the PBMs are the middleman that basically do the legwork between getting the pharmaceutical from the manufacturer to the pharmacist so that it can be dispensed to the patient. And the PBMs were originally supposed to keep the cost of the drugs down, but have subsequently become parts of the insurance company, and have a bunch of subsidiaries and a whole variety of complex companies that are now actually making a huge amount of money through several different mechanisms that actually winds up making it more expensive for patients to get drugs. So the pharmaceutical companies are told by the PBMs that they need to give the PBMs a rebate in order to get their drugs put in the right place on the formulary. And that rebate seems to be getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But the PBMs will not pass on the entirety of the rebate to the insurer, right? So the insurer is paid for by your employers, right? Your employer has an insurance plan for you guys, and that's just the way employment insurance works, right? So you've got your insurance plan. The PBM is supposed to pay back what it costs the insurer to pay for the drugs. And then they're also supposed to help the pharmacist. If the pharmacist buys wholesale the drugs, they're supposed to pay the pharmacist as well for their out of cost. But what they do is they keep the rebates for themselves, or a big chunk of the rebates for themselves. That's supposed to make the payment to the insurer. They're supposed to pass that on to the insurer so the insurance prices don't go up. And they also then often pay less than what they recoup to the pharmacist. So the out-of-network pharmacies, little businesses, independent businesses, are not able to get the full amount that they should be getting for dispensing these drugs. And so many of them have gone out of business. And you've seen a consolidation of multiple pharmacies into CVS and Caremark and Express Scripts and Optum. There are all sorts of insurance companies that have bought up. There are 3 insurance companies that have bought up PBMs because the PBMs are so profitable that the 3 major ones are actually in, I want to say, the top 25 of Forbes 500 list. So they are. It's complicated to explain logically because there's so many moving parts to it. But long and short is the pharmaceutical companies have been forced to raise their list prices, and those list prices will increase the price for the pharmacist to buy, which then they don't get fully reimbursed for. And then when they dispense it to the patients, a lot of those costs will get passed on to the patient. So they've been found, they have been charging much, much more for drugs that are even legacy old drugs. And they steer often to more expensive drugs because they can take a bigger chunk for the rebates. So the generics get priced out of the market, and since they're priced out of the market, they stop making them. And because they stop making them, that increases drug shortages. So I've seen drug shortages for an incredible number of things that in 2000, when I first started practicing medicine, there was no such thing as drug shortages. They're very rare. By the time I finished practicing, a huge number of very, very important drugs, chemotherapeutic drugs, nausea drugs, all sorts of things, very hard to come by. So it's complex, and it's really hard to kind of navigate the nuances of all of it, but it's getting regulated soon.
Yeah, really important stuff. One other thing, you may have mentioned this in passing, but I just missed it. But there's this practice of prior authorization.
Yes.
Where you have a doctor who sees a patient and says, this patient needs this drug in this dose for this length of time, writes the prescription, and then the patient's insurance company oftentimes will step in and say, no, not so fast. We have to approve this. So in essence, you have the insurance companies that have, in many ways, screwed up the healthcare system.
Yes.
Interposing themselves between the doctor and the patient because they have the influence to do that. I find that personally outrageous, right? The whole point of going to doctors is to see the people who are experts who can treat you, and now they're not being allowed to make that decision. Do you have any?
And that's what's happened to medicine, that's a large driver of the exodus from medicine. This started happening in the 1990s, where once you shifted to this whole HMO method, and insurance companies realized that they had the power to make decisions. And so they've increasingly over those years, and with every government intervention, the practice of medicine has gotten more and more complex. So I don't understand why people in medicine think socialized medicine is the way to go, because we've got clear evidence that every intervention has caused an exponential increase in the cost of care, and an exponential increase in the administrative burden that has gotten in between the doctor-patient relationship. So in the 90s, HMOs realized that they could have some say in things. And so when my dad was practicing later on in his career, he used to say, you need brain surgery. I'm going to do brain surgery. He would then do brain surgery, and if he hadn't gotten prior authorization for that, he wouldn't get paid. And so that has grown not just for procedures, but into, no, you're not going to prescribe this medication. You're going to prescribe that medication. You have to spend all sorts of time on a phone. I mean, imagine calling a phone company and trying to, how long you have to wait on hold, right? To get anything through a phone company or change your cable or whatever. Now do this when you're a doctor and you're trying to take care of patients. You have to pay somebody to spend all sorts of time on the phone to get approval for a drug that that the patient needs. And it happens so routinely now that people have unbelievable frustration. You can't even talk to a person. And you've got a person who's not at the bedside, who's not qualified to make these decisions, even if they are a physician, Monday morning quarterbacking you. Some of the physicians that they've hired have got malpractice cases against them, have got all sorts of things going on that made them not qualified to practice medicine. I'm not saying all the physicians that work for insurance companies are that way, but it's gotten just incredibly bureaucratic. And I think that I would love to do a space or a podcast where we get experts who can really talk about the impact this has had. But PBMs, everybody likes to point at big pharma, but PBMs have really increased the cost of hospital care, or of patient care, and they've also really impacted the quality of the work that doctors can do because you're so busy trying to get prior authorizations done.
So fascinating. You made a really important point about government intervention necessitating more intervention. Because the government steps in, that has adverse consequences, then they have to fix those, which of course they fix with another law or another regulation.
Yeah.
And there's a couple examples. The most important that I learned years ago, which was fascinating, is that after World War II, in order to avoid paying more taxes or having to collect income taxes from their employees, companies started offering health insurance as an alternate means of compensation because it wasn't taxed the same way or at the same rate. It may not have been taxed at all at that point. I'm not sure. But in other words, that funneled millions of Americans into the health insurance, the employer health insurance system, right? So in other words, it was just something as simple as we're going to tax income now, or we're going to increase the income tax on the money you make. And just like that, you create this system, right? And because more and more people, and in fact, most people by law in the United States now have to have healthcare coverage, and most of them get it through work. Mm-hmm. So in other words, you've passed a law that over time has metastasized into this dysfunctional behemoth, this resource-sucking behemoth that has its own interests now.
Yep.
And not the patients. So that's a real problem. One final example. This comes from an article at the Mises Institute. This is their website is Mises.org. This economist is named Connor O'Keefe. Highly recommend this article. I'll put it in the show notes, but he points out, I'm just going to read it because it's pretty clear. So he says, when the Obama administration forced every American adult to buy health insurance, it also imposed a cap on insurance companies' profits. But the cap just led insurance companies to purchase pharmacies and pharmacy benefit managers and raise the prices Americans have to pay for generic drugs, funneling that money into their own pockets. One more, and then we're done. In other words, the very interventions we were told would make healthcare more affordable have only allowed pharmacies, insurance providers, and drug companies to extract even more money from American consumers. So in other words, right, you had people like Elizabeth Warren saying, you know, we're gonna bring out price transparency, and we're gonna, these greedy pharma bastards, we're enough of this, right? Or these greedy insurance companies. So they put a ceiling, right? You can't make any more money than this. And so the companies are like, well, we'll just buy everything else.
Yep.
And we're technically complying with the law because we're not violating that limit. I think that the provision in Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act said you have to spend between 80 and 85% of your profits on health claims.
Patient, yep.
Yeah. And so they're like, okay, well, we can do that, and we'll just buy everything else, and we'll incorporate it into our system, right? So, it's just, you can screw things up very easily by tinkering with things that you shouldn't.
That's exactly right. And insurance companies, this is all, impacting taxpayer dollars, right? So the hospitals are using taxpayer dollars, and nonprofit hospitals are. Insurance companies are getting funded, getting paid by Medicare, right? Or Medicaid. Medicaid in particular, it's you hear people say that when states don't want to raise Medicaid payments, you hear people go after those legislators saying that they don't want to raise Medicaid for poor people and they're discriminating against poor people. Well, there's a big insurance company that has been contracted with to manage Medicaid claims, and the CEO of that company was the richest healthcare executive, made $25 million a year and he just recently died, but it's Centene. He was, I think his name was Neerdorf. He made $25 million a year, and that's Medicaid money, and they have mismanaged that in multiple states and have been taken to court in multiple states. And so those are your taxpayer dollars going to these kinds of things. And so there needs to be a big rethink on how we do medicine, because doctors are leaving in droves. Just because you have coverage does not mean you get care. And that's conflated all the time, right? If you don't have access to a doctor, the hospital that I used to work at is its own huge complex. It's building new buildings every single day, and you still can't get in to see a doctor for months at a time. And we used to say in the United States that one of the reasons why our healthcare was expensive, that it was worth it, was because you could get in and see a doctor and have a procedure rapidly. That's no longer holds, right? So there's so many nuances to this, and there's so many different parties involved that I think that we would maybe benefit from doing a whole space on it with some experts.
Yeah, just think about why shoes don't cost, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and big screen TVs, and like even higher value items, right? Like really expensive technology. Mm-hmm. Why doesn't an iPad cost $5,000? Mm-hmm. Like these technologies that run the world, the prices are coming down. And one of the reasons for that is the companies are allowed to innovate, for one thing. They're not regulated to death. Yep. But the incentives aren't perverse, right? These companies make more money when they can sell more of their product to more people. Mm-hmm. So the incentive is to make the product better, make it faster, make it cheaper, make it stronger, et cetera, et cetera. And that nothing's perfect, don't get me wrong, but that creates incentives that bring prices down and increase people's access and the variety of products and so forth. And one of the reasons insurance sucks so much, our health insurance system, is because you basically have to turn it into cafeteria food, and everybody gets more or less the same thing, unless they're rich and powerful. Then they can get better and better health care. But in order to scale something and provide it to everyone, you have to turn it into, here's your peas, here's your mashed potatoes, here's your mystery meat, on to the next one.
That's right.
That's the only way the system can scale. And because of that, sick people get overlooked, they die, they suffer as a result of that, and it's terrible.
Yep.
Okay, well, we'll wrap it up. That's, as I like to say, have a lovely week, everybody, since we had such an encouraging story there to end with. Come back next time. We'll have 3 more stories. Come to our spaces. They are every Friday at 11 a.m. Central Time. Bring your questions, bring your comments. We will let you speak, especially if you disagree with us. We like to have dialogue. So Unlike some people, we won't kick you out of our conversations, and we won't call you stupid. You get to say your piece, and it's a great time. And everyone
just as long as you're polite.
Yes. Don't call anyone a shill or any other bad words.
That's right.
You can call me a shill, and then I'll explain to you why you.
I'm called a shill all the time.
I will disabuse you of that notion that you have been force-fed. But be nice to everybody else, please. Okay. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time. Oh, of course. Sorry, I got the dad brain. On Twitter, it's at Dr. Liza MD. I am at CamJ English. Follow us. Questions, comments, just general observations about life. We'd love to hear them. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.